This is 5.4 Bone Fracture Notes. The essential question is, what are the most common bone fractures? Who do they affect? And what areas of the body are affected? Bone fracture is a break or a crack in a bone. There can be several causes. One cause can be any high-level stress or impact or force or pressure put on a healthy bone will cause it to break, or any disease process that can weaken or hollow out a bone can cause fractures. There are two main types of fractures. One is called a closed or simple fracture, which means that the bone stays inside the skin, doesn't break through the skin. And then an open or a compound fracture where the bone is sticking out of the skin. Obviously, the compound fracture is more severe. There could be dangers of infection, and it's definitely a lot harder to treat and heal than a simple fracture. The most common types of fracture is the only ones we're going to discuss. The first one being the comminuted fracture. It refers to a fracture where there are more than 3 pieces of bone, and it can occur in healthy or diseased bone, and definitely in bones in the elderly. What you are looking at is the broken bone in the humerus. You can see multiple pieces of bone here, and then what you are looking at here is the ulna and then the radius. So obviously this is a fracture of the humerus around the elbow region. A compression fracture means that the bone has been crushed, or basically think of a building where the building floors have collapsed on top of each other. That's what a compression fracture. And it is common in the vertebrae, in the spine, and it occurs a lot in elderly patients that suffer from osteoporosis. So you notice here, you are looking at the lumbar vertebrae, and this portion is called the body of the vertebrae, and notice how tall it is. And then when you look at this one here and compare that, it is much, much shorter because the bone here has been just crushed inward. It has collapsed on top of each other. Depressed fracture commonly occurs in a skull, where somebody takes a hammer or a baseball bat and hits them over the head. It is a dent or a pressed inward of the bone. So you can see here the bone has been dented in. That's a depression fracture. Impacted fracture occurs when bones, especially long bones, the ends of the long bones are forced into each other, and it commonly occurs, let's say, in the forearm where you are falling and you stick out your hand to stop the fall, and so the bone basically force is coming on either direction, and the bone can't withstand that force, and then the bone breaks. It could also occur in long bones like the tibia and fibula. Let's say you jump from a high height and landed with your feet. That means there is force traveling up that tibia and the fibula, and there is a force of gravity pulling down on you, and what's going to happen is the bone's going to go out, and so there's a little break here. Here's the break right here. Okay, and there's a little chip here. So that is an impacted fracture. Spiral fracture is a jagged or ragged break in the bone where there is a twisting force going on, and usually it's going to be at a diagonal, and then you can see a kind of like a spiral kind of break too. That's a spiral fracture. This is most common in sports injury where the bone has twisted. So think of a football player playing, running on the turf, and they plant their feet and their body is being churning and their feet are together. What's going to happen, there's going to be a twisting motion in that direction, and the foot is planted, it's going to crack. Also, it often is found in children when an adult grabs their arm to pull them toward them, and what they do is as they're pulling, there's a twisting motion, and so the bone breaks in that spiral, that twisting fashion, and then that could indicate child abuse. A green stick fracture only occurs in children, and it is an incomplete break in the bone because in children the bone hasn't fully ossified, hasn't hardened, it is still cartilage, so they're a lot more flexible and they don't break. So what you're looking for is that portion of the bone is going to stay unbroken, and then there'll just be a crack in the bone on one side, so it hasn't completely broken through. The main thing for healing of bone fracture is the treatment would be reduction, which means that if the bone is out of its place, then it needs to be reset, realigned, straightened out. And then after that, it needs to be immobilized. And depending on how severe the break is and how misaligned it is and how many pieces there are to the bone, you could either put a cast on it, or if it's a heavy weight-bearing bone like the tibia or the femur, long bones like that, they would actually have to put on a screw traction on it to keep it in place. The first step in bone healing, there is a hematoma, and hematoma is a blood-filled swelling, and that contains all of the damaged tissues plus all of the platelets that's going to help slow down the bleeding, and then it will eventually create this massive swelling. So when you have a break, that's where you get that swelling from. Next, what's going to happen is now, since the two bones are in pieces, what it needs to do is create a connection between the two bones, and that's what is a fibrocartilage is going to do. It's a temporary patch for like a band-aid to keep the bones together. Then after that fibrocartilage callus is going to get replaced by a bony callus, which is a lot more tougher and more stable than the fibrocartilage callus. Then eventually what's going to happen is that bony callus is going to then get replaced by the actual hard bone, which is going to be a permanent patch. Okay, so in the first picture you see this big huge swelling, that's your hematoma. Next, you see all these little yellow web of lines, those are your fibrocartilage callus. Then that gets filled in with this yellow stuff here, which is temporary bone, and then eventually will get replaced by the bony callus, and that will lead into the permanent patch. And notice that the area where the break is, there is a little bit thicker because it's like a extra protection around the area, and it's much solid compact bone over there, and so it is pretty sturdy that it won't break in that area ever again. 5.4 notes homework is number 1, which type of fractures are common in children? Number 2, which are common in the elderly? Number 3, summarize the steps involved in repair of bone fractures.